I've recently had some friends and YouTube commenters talking about a new video game called Windrose, set in a fictionalized golden age of piracy. And whilst I do not have the time to play it myself, it prompted me to check out some videos and articles on it, to see if there's anything, cool in it. At the moment it doesn't feature a wide selection of ships, only 3, with the smallest one being the Ketch. It is a rather interesting choice, because whilst the Ketch was a common sight in the colonial world, they were not regarded as a good pirate ship. Pirates wanted ships that were lightly built and speedy, and at the face of it, the Ketch was entirely unsuitable for it. William Dampier, a buccaneer scholar, described the Ketch he sailed aboard as sluggish, making long voyages longer and only performing well with the wind directly at her back. A French priest who sailed with pirates, Jean-Baptiste Labat, described the Ketch as follows. These Ketches are generally used for cargo, and only sail well with the following wind. Yet, Labat goes on to say that not only did he know of a filibuster crew who did go roving aboard a Ketch, but also, quote, made a good number of prizes. Pirates could not always pick and choose. They had to sail what they could get, and it seems that, somehow, in the right hands, the Ketch could be a decent pirate. In this video, we will take a look at the properties of the Ketch, what made her a bad pirate ship, but also how some pirates managed to make good use of her, against all odds. Nowadays, the Ketch is defined by a specific type of rig, but this was not the case in the Age of Pirates. During this period, ships were more so defined by the construction of their hull, sometimes the hull and the rig, and this was also the case for the Ketch. This hull was strongly built, beamy and round-sterned. It was a stable but sluggish design that could remain standing in a float in a rough sea, but didn't cut through the water speedily like a sloop or brigantine, more common pirate ships. These properties might seem a bit contrary to her name, Ketch, which according to dictionary.com, cited on the Wikipedia page for the Ketch, comes from the word catch, and according to an older meaning, denoted chasing or pursuing. Some historians have thus dubbed her the English equivalent of the Dutch yacht, whose name derives from the word jacht, meaning to hunt. The yacht was a 17th century scouting and privateering ship, eventually ending up as a luxury craft of leisurely cruising. Of course, the only catching the Ketch was doing was catching up. Maybe the catch referred to the catch of the day, as a fishing vessel, but another theory goes that the name comes from the French word cache, meaning a storage, and there's a good reason for it. In his book Colonial Sailing Craft, William A. Baker speculates that the Ketch originally came from Scotland. It was one of many local vessels derived from Norse designs, famed for their sturdiness in the hard northern sea, and excellent for fishing. Until the mid-19th century, Scottish fishing craft were all open boats. What distinguished the Ketch was that it had a deck, and was thus able to store cargo safely and securely. The fact that a Ketch was a decked vessel by the late 15th century can be discerned from some documents from the 1480s, thus making cache the root of its name a feasible theory. During the late 15th century, Ketches were in general use across Great Britain, often found on rivers and estuaries, and in the 16th century was documented as a common fishing craft, often being used for catching oysters. Sadly, there is very little maritime art from this period of English history, and combined with the lack of documentation, it is difficult to say for certain what the early Ketch looked like. Written descriptions did not become more common until the early 17th, with various authors like Baudelaire and Mannering, a former pirate, described the Ketch as small, sturdy, and easy to handle. It was now used all across the English-speaking world, from England itself to the New World colonies. For the rest of the century, its design would more or less stay the same, at least when discussing the hull. So, let's take a look. Baker summarized the hull of the Ketch as double-ended, round-sterned, strongly built, beamy, and flush-decked. Of course, this might not actually mean anything to you, so let's try to explain it. The most notable feature of the hull was that it was double-ended. This means that the bow and stern had the same shape. Inherited from the Norsemen, this sort of structure did reduce speed and cargo capacity, but made a vessel more stable and seaworthy in difficult seas. Traditionally, we think of double-ended vessels as sharp at both ends, say a canoe, but the Ketch was rounded instead, similar to the Dutch flute. As the 17th century progressed, Ketches started losing their double-ended form, many gaining a flat stern instead. This was part of a trend where the word ketch came to increasingly define a rig instead of a hull, or a hull and rig together. A lot of ketches had a pinked stern. This meant that the stern was round, but got more narrow or pinked higher up, as can be seen here. Strongly built is a bit more difficult to define, but implies that the hull was built to be heavier and sturdy, utilizing denser framing and stronger types of wood, improving the seaworthiness at the cost of reducing speed. And for ketches built in the northern colonies, white oak was the primary wood, with pine being used for the deck. Beamy means that the hull had a prominent beam, that is, the width of the widest point of the hull, which is typically amidships. A wide beam provided greater stability, again improving the seaworthiness, and it also improved the defensibility. If you wanted to board a ketch, you had to lay your vessel alongside, which was more difficult with the beam pointing out so prominently. If you boarded from a vessel lower than the ketch, the shape was more difficult to climb. Being double-ended, beamy, and having a somewhat marked breadth-to-length ratio, the ketch could almost be described as round. Whilst it didn't improve speed, it did improve maneuverability, something which is absolutely crucial when sailing in difficult weather. Finally, the ketch had a single, flush deck. This meant that the deck was continuous from stem to stern, without any raised superstructures. Raised superstructures reduced stability by making the ship heavier at the top, and removing them improved both manageability, but also speed. The definition of a ketch always being flush deck seems to have been especially prominent in the Navy, where some vessels would be called a yacht if they didn't have a flush deck, even if they had a ketch rig. If the superstructures were then leveled, it would be redefined as a ketch. In the colonies, this requirement might not have been as rigid. In 1677, shipwright William Carr built a ketch in Massachusetts, with a 12-inch high forecastle and a cabin raised 2 feet high. This might seem like a very low cabin, but those 2 feet were only the upper parts of the cabin, with most of it being located below deck. Now, neither of these superstructures were especially high, and if you look at images of ketches, you can see that a lot of them have a curved shape, with the ends being higher than the midpoint, but the deck between them still being flushed. So maybe a hull could still be defined as a ketch if the shape was curved with raised ends, or if the superstructures were just slightly raised. To summarize the ketch hull, it was heavy, with a rounded front and back, a bulging midpoint, and a more or less flush deck. All of these features served to make her more stable and seaworthy, making her excellent as a deep-sea fisherman and long-distance trader, but less suitable for speedy tasks like escaping or pursuing. With that said, let's see how the rig of the ketch might have played into these strengths and weaknesses. When talking previously about the flush deck, I mentioned some ambiguities in defining the ketch hull, and this also rings true for the rigging. During the 17th century, there was basically both a type of hull and a type of rig called ketch, so a ketch could be defined by its hull or its rig, either if it had both or one of them. The very basic rig of a ketch consisted of a bowsprit, a tall mainmast placed just before the hull's midpoint, and a much shorter mizzenmast placed near the stern. The main was rigged with a large square sail, and the mizzen with a lateen sail. This basic type of rig could be used by the very smallest of ketches, even if some might be rigged in a different fashion. It might date back to as early as the 16th century, being seen on a depiction of the 1545 Battle of the Solent. By the mid-17th century, larger ketches deployed an advanced form of this rig. The mast remained the same, but it was now additionally mounted with a jib on the bowsprit, a topsail above the main course, a topgallant above the topsail, and on the mizzen, a topsail above the lateen. This appears to have been the standard ketch rig of the 17th and 18th centuries, and would even be seen on ketches which did not have the ketch hull. On the face of it, the ketch rig appears to be quite flexible. You have your square sails that perform excellent with the wind, without having square sails astern that block the wind from getting to the sails on the mainmast. With the mizzen lateen, you gain the ability to sail slightly against the wind. Whilst the ketch did have a lot of sails, these sails were also small, and caught less wind as a result, making the ketch slower than a sloop rig, which deployed fewer but larger sails. Since the ketch was built as a merchant or fishing boat, this was not a problem, since the smaller sails required fewer men to maintain. Merchants wanted to pay as few men as possible, whereas pirate ships, as a comparison, were heavily crewed, and could thus afford to have more sails, and also alternate modes of propulsion. More on that in a bit. So as we can see, the rig of the ketch played perfectly into the qualities of her hull. But ketches also deployed very different looking rigs. The ketch rig of today is different from the one previously presented. Notably, it's entirely lacking in square sails, having replaced them with gaff sails. Similar rigs could be seen in the 17th century as well, with this ketch having no bowsprit, but a kind of jib staysail connected between the prow and mainmast. The mainsail is a spritsail. A French definition claimed that a ketch had a gaff and fore and aft rig, like the yacht or hoy. I mentioned during the hull construction that a lot of ketches had a pinked stern. There was also a type of ship called a pink, and it had a lot of overlap with the ketch. If a ketch was fully rigged, that is, had 3 masts with primarily square sails, she'd be called a pink. However, the hull of a pink wasn't as strictly defined as the ketch. It only needed a pinked stern, and pinks were often much bigger than the ketch. There are also cases of vessels with a pinked stern and a ketch rig being called a ketch-rigged pink, even though it could just be defined as a ketch or a pinked ketch. This serves to highlight the ambiguity and fluidity of ship definitions in the period, and to summarize it, it seems that, in the 17th century, there was both a ketch hull and a ketch rig. Since we're on the topic of propulsion, and also having talked a bit previously about maneuverability, small boats like the ketch could just be steered by a tiller, a pole connected directly to the rudder. However, Dampier mentioned how his ketch was steered by a whipstaff, a vertical pole connected to the tiller in turn, making it more manageable by a single man. Up until the invention of the ship's wheel around the year 1700, tillers were the most common steering mechanisms of sailboats and smaller ships, anything lighter than the biggest vessels, which could only use a tiller. Sails were not the only mode of propulsion favored by pirates. Some naval officers regarded oars mounted on sailboats as a sure sign of a pirate, since their added flexibility gave pirates more opportunities to pursue and escape, regardless of the wind. Whilst men of war and merchants did also use oars, it was a favorite pirate tactic, and they preferred vessels which were built suitably for the use of oars. They had to be long and fairly even, which the ketch was not. Being round and somewhat short, it did not lend itself to rowing. Indeed, the ketch was described as being poor in sailing and the pursuit, something which a good pirate ship had to excel at. That is not to say that pirates or sailors in general could not put a ketch to good use when pursuing or escaping pursuit. In the case of the latter, we do have an anecdote shared by William Dampier from his time sailing aboard a smuggler's ketch. Dampier described this vessel as a dull sailor, even when lightly loaded. She was now full of heavy cargo, and only sailed well with the wind. Near Mexico, they were spotted and pursued by 2 full-rigged Spanish ships. As soon as they were spotted, the ketch edged towards the sea, but the Spaniards were good sailors, and one managed to come within gunshot. Luckily, the land wind died all of a sudden, and the sea breeze did not yet spring up. While waiting for the wind to return, the smugglers removed the foresail and remounted it into a stunsail. Ketch foresails, being triangular, performed in any direction that wasn't with the wind, whereas a stunsail extended out from the yards next to the main course, and just like it, performed best with the wind. They managed to get it up just in time before the sea breeze came, and came right before the wind. Thusly, they managed to put all of their available sail to use, whereas the Spanish ships, being fully rigged, had the aftersails block their headsails, forcing them to tack, sail in a zigzag. With the coming of a tornado, the Ketch gained significant speed, and was finally able to escape into the night. Dampier and his men were lucky that they had a wind at their most favorable position. From any other direction, they would have been screwed. It is possible that pirates could have deployed Ketches for pursuing in this fashion, but it would have been less reliable than simply getting a generally more speedy ship, like a sloop or brigantine. Indeed, Ketches were better for stratagems of deception. As described during the introduction, Labat mentioned one filibuster company putting a Ketch to good use. Instead of trying to improve the weaknesses and make the Ketch speedier, they played into her weaknesses by deploying tactics of deception. No one expected a Ketch to be a pirate ship, allowing the filibusters to sneakily approach and take their targets by storm and surprise. The round shape, maneuverability and turning capabilities of the Ketch made her good as a vessel for surprise. You could pretend to escape, only to suddenly turn, come about and present a volley or broadside. Ketches seem to have been poorly armed. Naval Ketches might carry as many as 14 guns, but the smaller sort might only have between 4 to 6, or none at all. Pirates might have loaded them up with swivel guns, or simply have preferred musket volleys. Taking on larger ships would have been difficult. The Ketch might have been better on the defensive, at least when protecting herself against boarding. In 1690, an English 4-gun Ketch was assaulted by an 18-gun French privateer when on her way to Portsmouth to pick up press-ganged sailors for the flagship. Captain Robert Audley realized early that his Ketch could not escape the faster privateer, and put his 24 men into a defensive posture. The privateer ran the Ketch away from the shore, and at 4 p.m. came alongside and boarded her. The French making 4 attempts at boarding her, being repelled each time, until only the captain and 7 of his men remained standing in the Ketch. On the 5th attempt, 2 of the English were cut to pieces, and the captain himself wounded in 4 places. Still, he took down 7 of the Frenchmen, all on his own. On the 6th and final boarding, all of the Frenchmen came over, and the 6 surviving Englishmen were forced to strike. The French captain was initially angered by the defiance of the English, and he punished Captain Audley by beating him with his cane. However, when Audley was taken to prison in Saint-Malo, the Frenchman had calmed down, and spoke fondly of the Englishman's bravery in the face of impossible odds. The document relaying this story was written by Audley's brother, and I'm sure he was entirely unbiased in portraying his brother's great acts of bravery, especially since Robert was currently imprisoned at the time of writing and awaiting ransom. It is possible that John Audley exaggerated some of Robert's deeds in order to drive up support and get him out of jail quicker. A different type of Ketch never used by pirates was the bomb Ketch. This was a Ketch carrying a small number of cannon or none at all. These were only really for defense, but her primary armament was a massive mortar mounted in the middle or the front of the boat. The bomb Ketch was never meant to serve as an independent vessel, but rather deployed for the specific use of bombarding land targets like cities and fortifications. It was essentially a type of siege equipment. Since pirates did not really engage in these types of large-scale sieges, they never used the bomb Ketch, but it is an interesting side note nonetheless. As another interesting side note, as an enjoyer of history and seafaring vessels, you might enjoy this book called Naval Legends, Cruisers. It features original artwork, blueprints, battle maps, and detailed 3D reconstructions of the 20th century's greatest warships. And the developers reached out to me personally to talk about this project. If it looks appealing to you, you can back this project via the link in the video description or pinned comment below, which will also support my channel by giving me a small cut of the profits. Between 1710 and 1720, Ketches were rather suddenly replaced by schooners in the New World colonies. Schooners deployed two masts with a fore and aft rig, one which had existed almost 60 years prior. And it's not like Ketches just disappeared. It was more so the case that the new name schooner was simply more popular, new and trendy. Ketches, both in construction and their name, continued to be used in Europe and the New World for the rest of the century and beyond. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Ketch, you might enjoy this episode covering an even smaller vessel, the Canoe. It's a very underrated vessel that was heavily used by pirates, and a great success. If you want to see more ship videos in the future, please leave me a comment and give the video a like to let me know. Of course, these videos are niche and don't tend to get a lot of views, and the best way of supporting my continued production of them is by making a one-time donation via PayPal or becoming a channel member or Patreon donor. This way, you can also watch the videos early and without ads. All links can be found in the video description. Enjoy!